With James Harden struggling mightily in this series against the Miami Heat, is there any sort of way that you could see him turning it around in games 3 and 4?
I'm gonna be blunt. I'm gonna say no. Hot take or not, aggressive or not, bias or not, I don't care. I have enough shown here. James Harden didn't have to give it everything he had because he had Joel Embiid to bail him out. He didn't have to rely upon his shot selection. He didn't have to rely on his ability to create space, facilitate the basketball, get to the free throw line. He just kind of cruised. He kind of did what he needed to do, hit a couple of shots here, had a couple of turnovers. Nothing of major eye-opening performance. But Joel's not here. You're the next guy up. You're supposed to be the superstar. Everybody in Philadelphia praised you within the first 2 weeks of being in Philly for this reason. You're in another big market. You represent another big city, and you logged in 41 minutes, and all you can give me was 20 points. 7 of those are from the free throw line, buddy. So that's 13 points realistically. 6 of 15, 1 of 5 from 3, a negative 10 in the plus minus field, 3 turnovers. You're getting outscored by Tyrese Maxey. You're getting outscored by Tobias Harris, who, once again, I am going to die on this hill and say if he is given the proper attention and shot selection, he will provide a spark on the offensive end. I mean, hell, he even gave you 4 steals today. That's more than James has probably had in his whole career in a game. So I'm literally over the fact that everybody said James puts you guys in a position to win. James is a guy that can lead this team. James is a guy that can run alongside Joel Embiid. And this little issue with Tyrese Maxey goes and shows me a lot because I get it. If you haven't seen the clip, you're not going to know what we're talking about. But there's an instance in a timeout to where James is on the bench and Tyrese is coming to sit on the bench. Tyrese sits away from James. James moves. Tyrese goes and sits away from him again. James follows him, sits next to him. Tyrese leaves again. He wants nothing to do with him. Granted, that could just be an exchange of word on the court. Somebody's upset at what somebody said. Or, quite frankly, it could just be that James Harden is ruining another team. James Harden goes and that diva mentality, that narrative that follows him and supersedes him is just embarrassing. And we lost by 20 points. Good job, Dallas. Way to fucking piss me off 10 times more than I've already been all day. But it's okay. I already predicted us losing 5, so I don't really give a shit. James Harden is a fraud. James Harden is a sham. And to me, James Harden is a bum. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say it. He's not washed. He can still play basketball. We all know that if he wanted to put up 25, 30 shots, he can do it and he can go and drop 35, 40 points. We understand that he can do that. Granted, I know that's a lot of shots to go and put up that many points, but I'm just saying, we all know that if James wanted to take over and take the shots away from people, that he can. I just think the way he carries himself, the way he performs in the postseason, and kind of how he carries himself within his teammates, the locker room, and off the court, he's a joke. I don't care how offensive it comes off. I'm not saying anything that I don't truly believe, and I'm not saying anything that other commentators and analysts haven't said. He's more worried about his external life than his dedication to the game. James Harden is not playing well in the postseason, like he never does. And James Harden's going to look at this and say, well, you know what? Can't say it was me. I gave you 20. I gave you 9 assists. I showed up. I was at practice. Joel didn't show up. Joel wasn't here. He wasn't giving it everything he had. It's because he's injured. You know what I'm saying? Like, the narrative is still going to follow you because you're still the next guy up to be that superstar. You were the one saying that you were the best one on the team. So, I don't know, man. I've been beating this drum for a while. Starting to make me laugh. Starting to make me a little bit giddy. Granted, I know it's at the expense of Joel Embiid's health because he's just kind of been injury prone the last couple of postseasons. But when you have somebody of the magnitude that is James Harden and you fail to perform, there's no excuse for me. I don't care if Joel's there or not. I'm not saying you got to win, but you got to play a shit ton better than that.
I think the interesting part with James Harden and this whole equation is in this series specifically. I mean, James Harden is getting outperformed by Tobias Harris and Tyrese Maxey. And I understand that Tyrese Maxey and Tobias Harris, they've had longer tenures than James Harden has. James Harden has only been here in Philly for a couple months at this point. But you would think somebody of James Harden's stature would be playing better basketball than what he's been displaying in this playoff series. And let's face it, I mean, 18 points per game in the first 2 games of the series is just not going to cut it. I've always looked at James Harden as one of the most prolific scorers, really, that this generation has to offer. And look, there's been this metric that I've always kind of used in football. There's a metric of like there are players that play extremely well during the regular season, yet they don't really perform well in the playoffs. Um, Really, like one guy that kind of stood out to me in that regard in football was Philip Rivers. Great football player during a regular season, but when it got to the postseason, he wasn't able to get it done. That's just one specific player from the NFL. And James is kind of similar in that aspect because James at one point when he was playing with Houston, I think the guy averaged like over 35 points a game, if not like 36 points a game. And James has been on incredible stretches where he's put up, 30, 40-point performances. Like it's a walk in the park. But ever since he's got to Philly after this trade with Brooklyn, he's been subpar. There have been multiple games where I've seen James Harden just shoot ineffectively for multiple stretches. And really in this series in particular, yeah, but it's like you mentioned, he was 6 of 15 in game 2. And you take away the free throws that he knocked down, which was 7, he would have scored 13 points. And for somebody getting paid the amount of money that they're getting, and essentially with Joel out until probably game 3, you would expect that James Harden would kind of essentially, take all that pressure on his back and try to get Philly a game on the road in Miami. Well, that didn't happen because in game 2, Tyrese Maxey dropped 34 points. I mean, Tyrese Maxey. I mean, I understand Tyrese Maxey is a solid basketball player. I mean, this kid can outright play. But James Harden has been in this league for over a decade. One of the best scorers that the NBA has to offer, and he's barely cracking 20 points. And Tyrese Maxey is almost getting 35 points a game. You could look at Tobias Harris. I know Tobias Harris has kind of been the odd man out in Philly when they brought James in, and really it was James, Joel, and Tyrese. That was pretty much the 3-man trio. But I mean, Tobias, say whatever you want about him. I mean, the guy's still producing at a decent clip despite being the 4th option on this team realistically. He dropped more points than James Harden in game 2 against Miami. And I just don't know how James is going to be able to turn this around. And I think it's really just because once Joel gets back into the lineup, Joel is going to be the dominant force on the offensive side of the ball. And I think it's going to revert back to what they've had really the last couple months with James in the lineup. It's mostly going to be Joel, Tyrese, and James is pretty much going to play third fiddle. And Tobias is going to slide back into that 4th spot. And I just don't really see James getting elevated in Philly's offense to the point where he becomes the second option as far as a scoring option goes. Because I think Tyrese Maxey is just playing too well. I mean, Joel averaged 30 points a game this year, is an MVP candidate, could possibly win the MVP when it's all said and done. And if you're getting outplayed by Tyrese Maxey, who has been on Philly for a couple years now, but has really kind of exploded on the scene this year specifically, I don't know how you could find yourself in a situation where you get elevated higher than him because Tyrese is playing great basketball. He's taking advantage of his opportunity and he's making the most of it. And I think moving forward, if any sort of impact comes with Philly getting back into the series, it's going to be Joel. It will not be James Harden. I just haven't seen enough from James Harden to tell me that he's going to be the primary force that gets Philly back into the series. It will be Joel if that happens. And honestly, it could even be Tyrese over James. James is really kind of sitting in that 3rd spot right now. And I don't see that changing. And, I know Kev is has a lot of disdain for James Harden just because, James has really kind of loafed it here and there, especially that last year that he was in Houston. When I look at James as a basketball player, great basketball player, but, has an ego the size of Texas. I mean, it's massive. I mean, there are points in time where I think that he's more focused on what's going on outside of basketball than what he's displaying on the court. I mean, there's basically like a whole Reddit page, or there's basically like, I mean, you want to talk about Twitter threads of him just dedicating so much time to the club where no matter where he goes. I just don't know if James really places basketball at the top of his priorities like he should. I think there are other influences in his life that seem to be taking up a large portion of his time. And I think basketball is kind of taking a hit as far as what he's been able to display on the court. I mean, there have been some people that have said that even James Harden is washed at this point. I'm not going to go that far, but if James continues on this trajectory, James is going to be just an average player within the next couple of years. There's a chance that he could turn this around. I'm not saying like this is the end of James Harden, but he's got to get it together. And if he gets it started right now, great. But I just don't think it's going to be him. I think it's either going to be Joel or Tyrese Maxey moving forward if it comes to the 76ers being a viable team. It will not be James. And that just seems to be the trajectory that James is on. He could definitely course correct it. He could definitely fix it. But right now, it's not looking good for him. And it just kind of leaves Philly in a bind because Philly expected a lot more than what they're getting. And that's unfortunate for Philly. Because Philly is a really good team if all their pieces are really working well together. But with James, it's not, and it's going to cost them in the end. That's just how I see it.